Welcome, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Natalie Kelly. I'm the Professional Research Associate here at the Canadian Centre for the Study of Co-operatives. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that I'm coming to you today from Treaty 6 territory, land of the Cree, Saulteaux, Dene, Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota, for millennia, and traditional homeland of the Métis. As this week began with the observance of the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, we reaffirm our commitment to the shared and necessary and very important work every single day to truth and reconciliation in our lives and in our communities, in the university, and in the co-op sector. For folks who attended our last month's co-op conversation, you would have heard from Marc-Andre that this year marks our Canadian Centre for the Study of Co-operatives 40th anniversary. I say our centre and our 40th because this centre belongs to us all. It belongs to everyone who has worked at, for, or with the centre. It belongs to everyone who's read a centre paper or report, everyone who's been at a centre talk, everyone who has attended a centre reception or gathering, formal or informal, over our 40 years. Everyone who has an awareness of what the centre is all about, and that includes everyone here today. So thank you. I say this because while organizations like ours may exist in law or policy or form, they only really come alive in our imaginations. They only prosper when we can feel them, and they are, at the end of the day, acts of will, of intention, and of purpose. They exist because we invoke them into being. To continue this period of celebrating the CCSC, it is my great pleasure to introduce you to our speaker today, Mitch Diamantopoulos. Mitch is an associate professor at the School of Journalism at the University of Regina and has been a research fellow with our center since 2012. Mitch's body of published work spans journalism, community-based research, and interdisciplinary scholarship. In 2019, he joined the board of the Canadian Association for Studies in Cooperation, CASC. In 2022, Mitch was named to the International Editorial Advisory Board of the UK-based Journal of Co-operative Studies. Mitch also founded two worker co-op newspapers, Planet S in Saskatoon and Prairie Dog in Regina. Residents here in Saskatchewan will undoubtedly recognize those papers as the go-to source to learn about local events, politics, lifestyle, and culture. His current research on the emerging global sector of news co-ops focuses on the model's capacity to structure democratic solutions to news market failures. So before we hear from Mitch, a word on our co-op conversation series. Over the next 15 to 20 minutes, probably 15, Mitch will give his talk titled Building Journalism Back Better, Can News Cooperatives Counter Journalism and Democracy's Deepening Crisis? Then we will have a short conversation, followed by all of us breaking into group discussions around a question which Mitch has posed to us for about 15 minutes. While we always lose a few people when we go to these breakouts, one thing we hear repeatedly in our evaluations of these talks is how much people value these informal opportunities to network. They are a way for you to meet new people, to feel a little bit awkward in those newfound acquaintances, or if you happen to be with people you already know, to revel in those reacquaintances. So if anyone is experiencing technical difficulties, you can message Stan Yu. Stan, please wave to the folks.
Hi, everyone.
He will be available to assist. We will be recording this session, and the link will be shared with everyone who registered for this event, as well as posted on our YouTube. All of that will be emailed to you after today's talk. Okay, Mitch, the floor is yours.
Natalie, for what was a pretty eloquent introduction, hard act to follow. I should start by saying thank you, not just to Natalie, but also to Stan and to Marc-Andre for making this chat happen. Events like this don't happen by magic, they take work. And sometimes they take nudging and cajoling. And so I want you to know that I speak not just for myself when I say that many of us appreciate the important work that the center is doing and continues to do. It's also on a more selfish note. It's great to see some familiar names of old friends and colleagues and even students on this conversation. I'm seeing names of people I haven't seen in the flesh since COVID, so that's really nice. I'm also happy to see that there are names I don't recognize, friends I haven't made yet. So I'm looking forward to chatting in the discussion groups later so we can get a chance to chat more one-on-one. So I will keep my presentation relatively slim and trim, 10, 15 minutes. And I'll start by saying perhaps that because journalists cannot resist puns and playing with the words, that I have good news and I have bad news. The bad news, I think, is by now pretty well known by everyone on this chat, if not on the planet. The news industry is going through a period of protracted crisis. We have newsroom downsizing, we have closures. It has become a cliche to say that the business model for journalism is broken. We have now vast news deserts sprawling across the Midwest of the United States and across increasing portions of remote and rural Canada. So the evidence of market failure is all around us. Unfortunately, lacking an abundant supply of quality news and significant viewpoint diversity is not without its spillover or knock-on consequences. This crisis for the news is, of course, also a democratic crisis. On the one hand, public trust in the press is declining. On the other hand, we see the rise of all forms of new misinformation, irrationality, conspiracy theories, and the emotionalism of a post-truth moment that is filling the vacuum where reasoned, logical, evidence-based news once presided. So we have a market failure in news production, to be sure, but we also have widespread democratic dysfunction. And again, you only have to turn on your TV news to see examples of that dysfunction in evidence. So that's the bad news, news you already knew. But I do want to emphasize the good news here today, because I think there's a lot of good news, which unfortunately is not well known, including in co-op circles. And that good news is that there are a great many news cooperatives that have been in existence for decades, which have survived, which have thrived, and which have provided not merely large scale reach for their editorial staff, but have also provided a different kind of news, a kind of news which is not beholden to the traditional constraints of investor-based media, which has a certain relative autonomy from the marketplace to use democratic discretion to put journalism first where otherwise commercialization might swamp the enterprise. So I would like to talk in specifics, in concrete specifics, about just a handful of working models. They say a picture is worth 1,000 words, and I think it's also true that a working model of a co-op that is successful is probably worth a small library of Mitch talking about why it might be a good idea. So I'm going to take you on a short tour through just 5 newspaper co-ops that have been very successful everywhere. Now, I should say the co-ops run everything from radio and cable TV to internet and streaming services. But I focus just one very narrow segment, and that's the daily national newspaper sector. Of course, these newspapers also have online versions, but I focused on this just because this is the toughest of the tough nuts to crack. If co-ops can penetrate a national daily news sector as they have in several countries and become, in fact, the #2 daily newspapers in those countries, then it shows that the model is robust and in the most difficult of circumstances can succeed. So that's the reason I'm focusing on these particular co-ops. I have another reason, though, which is less economic and more political, and that is that the daily press has a historic role and responsibility in democratic societies. This is why we provide the press with constitutional protections. And that is because the medium of record is generally the first point of contact for citizens as they develop their civic literacy, as they learn to become citizens, as they become educated for democratic citizenship. So in this sense, the crisis for corporate journalism right now is also an opening for a deepening of the democratic project and a widening of the democratic discourse. It is, I would say, a reform moment for journalism. Certainly, there's plenty of crisis and risk to be had here, but it is also an opportunity to take a closer look at the continuing relevance of news cooperatives and to build back better with a more inclusive journalism, a more wide-reaching journalism, a more diverse journalism. And as I walk through these 5 cases, I think you will see that there is substantial evidence that co-ops in many different national contexts have made great gains in many countries for many decades and at a significant scale. So with that long and winding intro, let me walk you through the first example I have here, which is from Italy. So in Rome, you will find a feisty little newspaper called Il Manifesto, which is inspired by the great late anti-fascist journalist Antonio Gramsci. It was founded as a vehicle for the New Left way back in 1969, and it has been publishing as a daily ever since 1971. So that is a pretty long tenure. It's a worker co-op with 55 staff. Its audience includes online and print subscribers in excess of 20,000. It is the smallest national daily in Italy, but it has proven viable for half a century at significant scale, and it offers Italians a meaningful editorial alternative, including cooperative advocacy, because of course, Italy has a hugely outsized cooperative sector, particularly its worker co-op sector. And so that is both reflected in the pages of Il Manifesto, and that culture is reinforced by the daily readership of Il Manifesto. Moving along quickly to Berlin, we have here a very difficult to pronounce daily newspaper, which even Germans prefer to describe as Taz. So I will follow their lead. It has a large daily circulation of 60,000, so it's a significant player in the German newspaper market. The Newsroom employs 140 people, so this is no small tiddlywinks undertaking. It's a consumer co-op with over 17,000 members, but the Newsroom is self-managed by the journalists. So in a way, this is an early anticipation of what now we would call a multi-stakeholder co-op or a solidarity co-op. So the workers and the consumers have a power-sharing agreement in this co-op. This was launched also to fill a gap in the news market. which was dominated by corporate media, which tended to chase affluent readers and lean ideologically right. It responded to a vibrant green movement in Germany and offered a left-green alternative. So it is very much a going concern in Berlin today. Moving along to the Americas. In Mexico, La Jornada was founded later, but is much larger. It was founded in 1984. It is also a worker co-op. It employs 350 staff. It is one of the leading Mexican dailies with a readership daily of 110,000 people. Compare this, for example, to the US's largest nonprofit newspaper, often held up as the ideal for North American media reformers, the Philadelphia Inquirer. Its circulation is actually double that example. Finally, for those of you who are fans of Noam Chomsky, it might interest you to learn that he is a big fan of La Jornada. He argues it is maybe the only real independent newspaper in the hemisphere. And depending on how you feel about Noam Chomsky, you may feel differently about that quote. Nevertheless, moving along to Montevideo, and for those of you who also are not great at geography, Montevideo is in Uruguay. This paper was launched relatively recently, world historically speaking, in 2006. It is another worker co-op. This sector is dominated by worker co-ops because journalists want to have control over their work. It employs 137 staff. They have over 12,000 subscribers, and it has risen in the course of short of 2 decades to the position of second most read national newspaper. Interestingly, I don't know what they put in the water in Uruguay, but the second leading weekly in Uruguay is also a worker co-op. It's a cultural magazine, which is called Brecha. Yes, so in Athens, there's a publication called Ephemerida ton Syntacton. This is a Phoenix co-op, which means that it rose from the ashes of a previous newspaper, which ran into hard times during the economic crisis of 2012, like so many other media outlets. It has managed to rally and reassert itself in the market. It has 150 members. It's a worker co-op, and like Montevideo, a worker co-op also operates the second most read daily in this country, in Greece. So that's a quick and dirty run through a few examples of why I think there's grounds for optimism when we talk about rebuilding back better after journalism's epic difficulties of the last decades. There are a few reasons in particular that I think these cases should reassure us and re-energize us to refocus on building the media back better on cooperative foundations. The first is that they all clearly illustrate daily news co-ops can be viable, not just for a little time, but over the long term. Some of these co-ops have been publishing without interruption for over half a century, and all of them have been publishing without interruption for decades. The second point I'd make is that daily news co-ops can be viable at large scale. None of these are marginal players in the national conversation. They are all significant players in the national conversation. They all employ, if not dozens, then hundreds of journalists. And finally, in terms of the character of the news that they publish, when journalists make decisions about journalism, without being trumped by management or owners or by powerful forces who care less about journalism and more about shareholder dividends. There is greater freedom in the newsroom to make better decisions. There's more room for viewpoint diversity to address the issues of communities that are typically neglected by market-driven journalism. And this is particularly important for cooperators because it also expands the scope of democratic development possibilities. We all like to complain about how the corporate media neglect or mischaracterize cooperative enterprise. Obviously, if you have media that are co-ops, they have greater insights into what that means for overall economic strategy and building a more inclusive society. So all of these reasons, I think, should encourage us to think more carefully at what it is we can do to really move this sector forward. And now I'm out of oxygen, so I will stop speaking.
Thanks so much, Mitch. I love hearing about these papers. I had the opportunity to moderate a panel that Mitch was on in Bismarck this summer. So I have a question just before we head into breakouts. So you talked about misinformation, and we talked about disinformation and fake news and other threats to democratic citizenship, particularly as you noted that the press and daily newspapers and all news media is often people's first point of contact in exercising their democratic literacy and citizenship. Yeah, these threats are in action. We're in election season everywhere we look. So what do you see as the impact on the citizenry and healthy democracy? And could you just expand a little bit more on why the co-op model is ideal or has greater capacity to address some of these news market failures?
Yeah. Well, that's a great question, big question, but great question. I think, journalists love to be precious about how they are the guarantors and the watchdogs of democracy. And I think the last few decades have been a sobering reminder that we cannot take democratic norms and institutions for granted. There's certainly economic forces that are undermining quality journalism. We also now have a political phenomenon from the far right where journalists are intimidated, harassed, called names, singled out as enemies of the people rather than the people's servants. So this is a confusing period, I think, for journalists who are feeling very much up against the wall economically as well as politically. And are feeling kind of a disconnect from their audiences as well, and feeling quite perturbed about that too. So I think this has been a long-range period of phased retreat in which people are really shell-shocked and having a hard time knowing what to do next. And unfortunately, this often leads the press into defensive pleas with the public to understand that evidence is important and that shoe leather reporting is important and that it's not good enough to get your news from TikTok. And this is not so helpful. What we need is to really be talking about constructive alternatives that address both the crisis in the supply of journalism, but also the longer standing and legitimate criticisms that citizens have had about corporate bias in the media and the limitations that places on news, on press freedom. So I think that we live in a world now where somebody can post a meme about Haitian immigrants eating other people's pets for breakfast, and it's the top line story on the national news the next day. This is not an auspicious moment for journalism or democracy, and it kind of reminds me of that old saying, where journalism goes, democracy follows. Unfortunately, I think the opposite is also true. When democracy is in crisis, it tends to drag journalism down with it. And when journalism is in crisis, it tends to undermine democratic process as well. So we're in a bit of a death spiral here in which journalism and democracy both are kind of gasping for air and struggling to regain their footing. So much for my optimism.
You can tell us how co-ops are going to help all this, though.
Yeah. Well, co-ops always spring from market failure, right? Co-ops don't happen because everything is working great in the economy. Co-ops happen when things are not working great in the economy. I think of my own news co-op back in the day when Prairie Dog launched in Regina. We had a very sadly underserviced market, which it was a kind of a public sector town, government town, left-leaning town with a large unionized population, a large indigenous population. The paper, the daily paper at that point, which was a monopoly daily, you would hardly know that was the nature of the community from reading the paper. There was a complete demographic, ideological, democratic disconnect between what that chain paper had to say about the issues of the day and what people who lived in that city were actually experiencing. And so it was kind of an important intervention at that time. And Prairie Dog published without interruption in print for 3 decades, which is no small accomplishment, particularly since it really was kind of put together with binder, twine, and duct tape. It was truly a grassroots initiative waged by people who really had no clue what they were doing. And I can say that with authority because I was one of those people. But in a way, they were way ahead of their time. I think now everyone realizes that journalism matters and we need to do something about it. Prairie Dog and I think later Planet S tried to do the work before people were really kind of at the point where they realized just how urgent that work really was. And so, yeah, I think, there are a lot of people out there who are exhausted and who are demoralized and who are feeling defeated by the state of the press. But we need to, I think we need to take faith in the fact that if people in Italy can do this, are we so stupid in Canada that we can't do this? Is there a reason that Germans are a higher caliber of journalists than Canadians, that they can do it, but we can't do it? You only need to look to our history to see how important movement media have been to the co-op movement. Most of the established co-ops today would not exist if it was not for the Grain Growers Guide, which was the most widely circulated newspaper across the Prairie West in the early 20th century. The great prairie pools, whether they would have come to existence without the Progressive and the Western Producer is, I doubt it. But we forget, it's easy when we look at these institutions and we see objective metrics like sales and assets and revenues and members to forget the more ephemeral cultural aspects. What motivated, what inspired, what gave people this sense of camaraderie, this sense of community that they were willing to work with their neighbors to do, to take on a cooperative project. So we suffer a bit from social amnesia. We forget our own history, and I think that's pretty dangerous generally. But it's certainly the case with the co-op news sector.
Well, that's why we're glad to have you here today.
And that's why I'm glad to be
these
here.
Our center, I know our center has is very concerned about as well too. So I'm gonna stop you. Sorry, Mitch. I could listen to this all day. But I want everybody to be able to have the opportunity to have smaller conversations about this, including with Mitch. You'll end up in one of these rooms, Mitch. So we want to hear from all of you. These co-op conversations are meant to be an opportunity for us to socialize a little bit together and get into the nitty-gritty and talk as human beings about these really important topics like the one we're talking about today. So Stan's going to break you into groups. When you get to your group, and please stick around for these, they're absolutely lovely. Just tell everyone in your group who you are, where you're from, a bit about where you work or study or what brought you here today. So then I think we'll break out for 15 minutes, Stan, and then we'll come back as a group and just touch base and yeah, so we are going to start with a question that Stan is going to put into the chat. This is a question that Mitch has brought to us, which is one of the things we do with all of our co-op conversation speakers. So what, if anything, might individual cooperators, individual co-ops, and the co-op movement do to help build the co-op news sector in Saskatchewan? So excellent question. So I will see you back here in about 15 minutes. Sorry, we were in such a heavy discussion that I didn't even notice that the breakout rooms were going to end. So I hope everyone had such productive conversations. Yeah. First, I want to thank Mitch. That was absolutely fantastic. And I see, oh yeah, good, Prairie Dog. Stephen put his email into the chat. So I don't want to hold everybody up. We've come back to being pretty close to being on time. So as I mentioned before, we will be sharing a recording of this with everyone. Stan usually does that in the next day or so. Our next co-op conversation will take place on Wednesday, November 6th. It's always the first Wednesday at noon Saskatchewan time. So Central Standard Time. That'll be different soon for others. Our speaker next time will be Thomas Gray. Thomas recently published a paper through our center, which I've had the pleasure to read, titled Farmer Stress, Co-op Members, Problematic Solidarity and Recommendations from Dairy, a Qualitative Analysis. In that paper, he analyzed 1,000 comments from a survey of dairy farmer members of a dairy co-op in the Northeast United States and found that nearly all have some level of dissatisfaction with their co-op. And Thomas will present what he found and how other co-ops can avoid this cautionary tale. So registration for that event will be live in the next day or so through our regular channels. You may also be interested in an online event taking place on October 22nd, titled Food Systems and Nutrition Impact Research. It's a webinar led by Dr. Carol Henry at the University of Saskatchewan's College of Pharmacy and Nutrition. This webinar presents some groundbreaking research and expert perspectives on food systems transformation and how to improve food security and nutrition in East Africa. Stan will put the registration link in the chat for those who are interested. Just before we go, I see, Hazel, you have your hand up.
Yeah, thank you very much, Natalie. I wanted to just put out, and now we don't really have the time for it, if anybody had a best practice idea that came out of their session about this topic and specifically around how to support Prairie Dog and Planet S, like, could we have like 20 seconds per breakout group to hear it or something? Or if not, then maybe follow up with notes or.
Yeah, what if if people have have really good suggestions, you could send them in an email to me and Stan, or Stan, because you all have his email. And then maybe Stan and I can add those to the recording when he sends it out to everyone. Like, we could just send a list. Does that sound good?
That's great. Yeah, thank you.
Sorry, I volunteered you, Stan. Okay, well, with that, thank you, everyone. We greatly appreciate seeing you all, and just look forward to seeing you at these and other events that we'll be having in the future. So have an excellent Wednesday, and we'll see you again soon. Thanks again, Mitch.
Yes, great fun. Thanks.